Hi, welcome to a FireSide Chat with ConvinceMeAudio, episode 3. In this episode, we're going to tackle EQ. What is EQ? Should you apply EQ? And in which situations is EQ a detriment to sound quality? Let's begin. Starting with the basics, EQ is the presets or the ability to change the sonic characteristics of headphones, IEMs, and speakers. You might have seen jazz, pop, club, rock presets on a hi-fi that you may have lying around your house or on your phone under the sound settings. These are EQ presets, a profile that's already been constructed by an individual with a set of instructions to change the sound in a specialistic characteristic way to change it to that genre's best strengths. For example, an increase in bass and an increase in treble for jazz music, mid-range boost slightly for rock, reducing the treble region, etc. Now, these presets can be taken much further with an actual equalizer, where you can have up to 30 bands or as many bands as you like if you can manually input the preset to those specific frequency adjustments you want to make, anywhere from 20 Hz all the way up to 20 kHz as a rule. So you're thinking to yourself, I'm sure, okay, EQ doesn't sound too bad. I mean, my speakers are not really bassy. I fancy a touch of bass. What's wrong with increasing the bass a little bit? Or not enough treble, or too much treble, or not enough mid-range. Now, the rabbit can go very deeply. The problem is, EQ presets is just scratching the surface of actual EQ and tuning. It's a very in-depth, complicated process where it can be as easy and as complicated as you want to make it. The unfortunate thing is, you could fall down a rabbit hole. Making slight adjustments to a headphone could be an actual detriment. So let's break these topics down one at a time. Starting with, should you apply EQ? Applying EQ to your headphones and IEMs or speakers via DSP correction with a microphone most of the time is a little bit easier to do than inputting data yourself. Taking speakers, for example, and DSP correction, where it uses a microphone and a program to adjust the bass, the mids, and the treble to get the best sound for that specific room. This is my favorite and the easiest way to actually apply EQ, because the microphone is constantly listening for the feedback within reverberations around the room, applying it back to the microphone and making minor adjustments that way. Then you can fine tune what the DSP correction has done. This is a popular method, especially for the new sound bars and speakers on the consumer market as a rule. Something like the AirPod Max does this same procedure in headphones, where there is a microphone inside the cup listening to every nuance of sonic characteristic and feeding back to the processor, and the processor adjusting on the fly, depending on the genre of music and what you're listening to. It's a very clever method and it's very seamless. But applying EQ, a 30-band EQ or custom manual data input EQ to a headphone could almost break a headphone if you don't know what you're doing. So that brings us nicely to the next section of, should you apply EQ? Well, EQ is free. It doesn't cost you anything, and you can test it on your headphones, IEMs, and speakers and see how you feel. But be aware that you most likely, most of the time, end up breaking your headphones. So the best place to start would be something like applying already made presets that's already been made for you, such as the rock, pop, jazz, R&B, etc. presets that's already integrated into a lot of sound apps. And going from there, you can listen carefully and find, okay, I don't like this aspect of the bass, learning where that is and adjusting accordingly. I have absolutely no qualms with people using EQ, but EQ is not the answer to everything. And that brings us to the next section. EQ really does have to be studied and learned. I don't think anybody can do it on the fly unless they're just using one of these presets. And most of the time the presets don't sound very good. I have never really found one that I've truly enjoyed. Currently I'm using an IFI Go Blue. This applies a method of bass boost, for example, in where it increases the bass region by a very slight amount, and it can have a very good impact on headphones. But the majority of the time you can tell it's artificial, because here are some of the problems with EQ. EQ has to be taken on headphone to headphone basis. You cannot apply a sweep across all headphones. One headphone might take nicely to a bass region boost, another one might utterly break it and sound awful. Because the frequency response of all headphones, the tuning of all headphones is different. Not only this, sometimes variations from driver to driver from those two headphones, for example taking two hi-fi arias, could be slightly different, and this slight difference in the frequency response could have a detriment to the profile that someone else has already EQ'd for their aria. Not only this, but the age of the pads, how much they seal, how good are they at sealing around an individual's head will also have an impact. If a pad on one set of head is not sealed very well, but is perfectly sealed on another head, this obviously will apply a different result, though they are the same headphones. And if you take the former and apply it to the latter, then you realize the results are not exactly the same. There's a lot of considerations that has to be taken into account. Second of all, a lot of headphones can't take EQ. The driver just can't handle it. And it's because not only it might be because of the capabilities of the driver, but everything else that goes into making those headphones, such as the pads, the dampening that's been applied to those specific headphones, and how the chamber has been created in the cups, if it's a closed back, to form a room, a private room, which is basically what headphones are. It's basically your speakers on your head, but with a private room created around the driver to form that sound. Now, that headphone is specifically tuned for that room, which is that cup. So therefore, if you apply a little bass or a little treble, it could be the same result as taking your very well placed speakers in your room and actually moving the placement. And everybody knows speaker placement is key, because where the sounds bounce off around the room and off surfaces could have a massive effect on soundstage, on imaging, on bass, on peaks, on dips in the frequency response. And it's the same concept with headphones. Let's say you take the best of the best. Let's say you take a hi-fi Sasvara and EQ this. Some people do. I think they're absolutely nuts, but they're allowed to. Audio is subjective. You are allowed to. The drivers can take EQ very well, but what you end up with is not a Sasvara. It's a different headphone. If you touch it here, touch it there, even if you do a slight touch, it's not going to be the same as another Sasvara. Is that what you're looking for? It might very well be. But in my experience subjectively, I have found applying EQ to headphones rarely ever works well, and the times it does, it's never stayed permanent on those headphones. I've always gone back to stock. And then you have the limitation of binding that EQ to your sound system. So if you've got something like a Stellia, which is portable, you can't carry that EQ forward. You will have to apply it to every music app you use, on every device. Very rarely would you ever find one where it carries over the EQ. The Apple AirPod Max does. You use accessibility settings and use the DSP correction in there, and iCloud allows you to carry this EQ forward across the entire system. Analog headphones don't. So this could be another problem. But the takeaway is, EQ can be good. EQ can be used wisely, but the majority of the time, I think it's a detriment to headphones. Find the right tool for the right job. And the best tool in my experience for headphones is roll-in pads. Because what you are doing is not touching anything on the driver. You're not making that driver vibrate a specific way in a specific amount of time beyond what it was originally tuned and made for. But what you are doing is changing the room that driver is set in. So for example, you're taking a little pair of speakers and putting it in a big room, a big pair of speakers and putting it in a little room. That's the simplest way I can actually put it. And pad rolling has a massive impact on headphone sound. In fact, a lot of manufacturers actually use pad rolling to tune a lot of their headphones. I'll give you an example. One review we just did recently, the Audeze LCD XC. It takes so well to pad rolling. Not so well with EQ. I don't like it. Though, funnily enough, the company themselves apply an EQ and ask you to apply it. So that one is a bit of a hit and miss really. I've tried their EQ and I don't like it. I've tried their pad rolling and I love it. So it might be very subjective person to person. But this has been my experience, and I think pad rolling is far more simpler for somebody who doesn't know how to EQ properly and add the correct amounts of values to each sonic specific frequency response. If you just slide up and down on mids and treble, you'll find it affects the treble, it affects the bass region. It's not just bound to that specific area, it will affect above it and below it. And it's all cohesive. That's why you could fall down this rabbit hole of turning your headphones from something great into something utterly awful. But it's not something to be scared about. It's something to be tried. You can always go back to stock. And it's free. Pad rolling isn't. EQ is. In my subjective opinion, I prefer pad rolling. I don't like EQ. If I want a different sounding headphone, taking the former or finding another headphone to do the job I want it to. I will not use an HD600 for EDM, and I would not use a Focal Clear MG for classical. The right tool for the right job. I hope you have found some use in this episode, and I would like to extend a massive thank you to our Patreon members who get early reviews and access to the private Telegram chat where we discuss topics such as these, equipment that has come in for review, and everything else pertaining to audio. I'll see you in the next episode. Peace.